It is the year 1000, and in the imperial city of Heian-kyo, the last notes of a courtier's flute drift across a moonlit garden. Let's move quietly through these wooden halls and paper screens, as the capital of old Japan settles into a night watched over by careful, ancient superstition. We enter, as most people entering this city from the south still do, along the great avenue named Suzaku, 80-some meters wide enough that it feels less like a street than a deliberate statement, which is exactly what it was 2 centuries ago, when Emperor Kanmu laid this capital out on a grid borrowed from the great Chinese city of Chang'an. At the avenue's southern end should stand this city's grandest gate. It doesn't not anymore. A storm brought it down 20 years ago, and no one has rebuilt it. It simply stands broken, timbers dark against the sky, the first thing every traveler sees on the way in and the last thing on the way out, and by now nobody in the city thinks of it as unusual. 20 years is long enough for a ruin to stop looking like news and start looking like scenery. Beyond the gate, the avenue runs north, and it splits the whole city cleanly in two, in a way that matters more than a line on a map should. To the east, where we are headed, the streets are full, noise, torchlight, the press of ox carts and servants and messengers moving between one great house and the next. To the west, the half of the city that was always built on the lower, wetter ground near the river, something quieter has been happening for a long time now. Fewer people build there each year. Fields creep in where city blocks were planned. It isn't abandoned, not exactly, but anyone walking this capital tonight would tell you, without needing to think about it, that half of it has been quietly turning back into countryside while the other half only grows more crowded. Nobody planned that when Kanmu laid his perfect grid across this valley 2 centuries ago. Cities rarely follow the plans drawn for them for very long. Somewhere in the eastern half of the city tonight, behind walls we cannot see from the street, the woman we're about to follow is finishing her evening's writing by lamplight. She is not the only such woman in this city, and she will not be the only one remembered from it. History will keep the names of at least 2 or 3 women writing in rooms very much like hers this same year, one of them just a few years from starting a book people will still be reading 1,000 years from now, though she hasn't touched that story yet, hasn't even entered court service yet. Ours has not written anything the way theirs will. She serves in one of the great households near the palace, the kind of woman whose job is equal parts company, correspondence, and quiet observation, and on a night like this one, mostly what she is doing is listening to the house settle around her. The house itself would look nothing like what most people, centuries from now, will picture when they imagine old Japan. There are no sliding paper doors set into fixed frames. That convenience is still centuries away from being invented. Instead, the whole residence is built the way every great house in this city is built. A main hall facing south onto a garden and a pond, linked by covered, open-sided corridors to smaller halls at the sides, the whole complex more like a cluster of pavilions than a single sealed building. Inside, there are no walls to speak of, not in the way a house needs walls now. Space gets divided as needed, moment to moment, with painted folding screens standing where a wall might otherwise go, silk curtains hung from wooden frames to soften a corner, bamboo blinds lowered against the evening air. A house like this doesn't have rooms so much as it has arrangements, remade throughout the day and night by hands moving screens exactly where they're needed and no further. From somewhere across the garden, this is the sound the hook we started with was reaching for. A flute is finishing whatever it was playing. Not any flute, a Ryūteki, the same reed-thin transverse flute that has been part of the court's own orchestra for generations. An ensemble of flutes and reed pipes and a mouth organ and drums and stringed instruments that together make up what everyone here simply calls the court's music. People who have heard the Ryūteki played well have described its sound as something like a dragon moving through open sky, which is a strange thing to say about an instrument until you've stood in a garden at night and heard exactly what they meant. The garden it's playing into is built for precisely this moment. A pond catches what moonlight makes it past the surrounding roofs, and if this were one of the nights set aside for it, someone would already have floated a cup of rice wine out across the water, timed so that whoever it drifts toward next has to compose a verse before it reaches them or forfeit the round. It's an old game, older than this house, tied to a moon viewing custom the court borrowed originally from China and then made entirely its own, wrapped now in an aesthetic this whole era has a name for. A particular, treasured sadness in watching anything beautiful because it won't last. Not the moon exactly, and not the season, but the fact of change itself, keenly felt precisely because everyone here has been trained since childhood to feel it keenly. A poem finished under a night like this one might be handed to a servant before sunrise, tied to a branch of whatever is blooming this season, sent across the city to arrive with someone's morning as both a message and a small piece of art. There is a scent in the air too, threaded under the garden's own night smells, and it did not get there by accident. Blending incense is one of this court's most serious quiet arts. Aloeswood and sandalwood worked together with honey and crushed plum and a dozen other things, mixed according to recipes some families guard as carefully as anything they own, burned to scent a robe before it's worn or a letter before it's sent. Somewhere in this house tonight, a chest holds robes already carrying next week's scent, prepared exactly the way a person centuries from now might lay out clothes for a morning they're already thinking about. Our courtier is dressed, even at this hour, in layer upon layer of silk, each layer's color chosen deliberately against the ones above and below it, the whole combination shifting with the season the way another era might change what flowers it keeps on a table. There is no single fixed number of layers that every woman at court wears. 5 is common enough, sometimes more, sometimes fewer, and what matters is not the count but the combination read by anyone glancing at a sleeve or a hem the way a modern reader might glance at the title of a book someone's carrying, learning something about the person without a word passing between them. None of this, the garden, the poem, the incense, the layered silk, happened by pure chance tonight, and none of it will happen tomorrow without the same quiet calculation behind it. This entire court runs on a system of divination inherited, like so much else here, from China and then reshaped into something distinctly its own. Specialists in yin and yang who read the calendar the way a modern person might read a weather forecast, except that what they're forecasting isn't rain, it's danger, and everyone who matters in this city arranges their life around what these readings say. If the direction you need to travel tomorrow happens to be occupied tonight by the wrong spirit, you do not go that way directly. You travel first to some other, permitted direction, sleep there, and only then continue on to where you actually meant to go. A detour built entirely around a compass instead of a map, and so ordinary a practice that no one in this house would think twice about rearranging an entire day around it. Other nights call for something closer to stillness than travel. When the signs turn bad enough, an unsettling dream, a date the calendar marks as ill-favored, a person simply stops. Doors stay closed. Visitors are turned away, sometimes with a small tag hung where anyone approaching can see it, marking the house, or the person inside it, as closed to the world until the danger passes. It is not fear exactly, or not only fear. It is caution treated as seriously as anyone tonight might treat a doctor's orders, and just as unremarkable to everyone living by it. If our courtier wanted the very best authority on any of this, she would not have to look far. Somewhere in this same city tonight, an old man in his late 70s is very much still alive, the most celebrated reader of yin and yang this court has ever produced, or will produce for a long time after him, trusted close enough to the throne itself that only months from now he'll perform a ritual for the emperor's own household when it moves to new grounds. He has held that trust for years already, and will hold it for a few more before his own death arrives. Tonight, though, he is simply somewhere in this same darkness the rest of the city shares, no more or less subject to it than anyone else. Beyond the garden wall, past the edge of what any single household controls, the city holds one more piece of caution built directly into its layout, and it has stood there since before this palace itself was finished. Northeast is the unlucky direction here, the direction, by an old borrowed reckoning, that misfortune is thought to slip in from, and so, on the mountain that sits exactly northeast of the city, a great temple has stood since this capital's earliest years for the specific purpose of standing guard over that one unlucky point of the compass. It has done that work quietly for 200 years now, so long that most people in the city below no longer think of it as a guard at all. It's simply the temple on the mountain. That it is also, still, doing exactly the job it was built for is the kind of fact this era holds without remarking on, the way a person today might live near a reservoir without thinking, each morning, about the dam. And there are nights, not every night, not even most nights, but nights the calendar itself is said to mark, when something is said to move through the streets of this very city after the household fires have gone down and most doors are shut. A procession of restless, unhuman things, passing along the avenues in the dark, bringing misfortune to anyone unlucky enough to cross their path without the right protection said aloud in time. Nobody in this house tonight could point to the last time it happened, or swear to you that it has ever happened at all in any way you could prove. It's simply something people here believe, the way people everywhere believe some version of the same thing. That certain nights are different from other nights, and that a house shut up tight before the wrong hour is a house that's done the sensible thing. Whether tonight is one of those nights, our courtier couldn't tell you for certain either. What she can tell you is what she'd do regardless. Keep the screens drawn, keep the lamp close, keep whatever charm or verse or quiet prayer she trusts between herself and whatever the dark outside might or might not contain. It is not so different, in the end, from checking that a door is locked before sleep, in a house very far from here. 1,000 years later, the specific fear changes with the century, but the small ritual of checking never quite goes away. Out past the garden, in the streets that ring this house and hundreds like it, the city's own night watch moves at a slower, less certain pace than it once did. There has long been a force in this capital charged with keeping its peace after dark, and for generations they were the one part of the old government that still reliably worked, long after other offices had gone soft with disuse. Even that is starting to loosen now, a little, in ways nobody at court would call a crisis yet, only a drift, fewer patrols where there used to be more, a little less certainty than a generation ago that the streets past midnight are exactly as watched as everyone assumes. It is the kind of change that is only ever visible looking backward, never in the moment it's actually happening. For now, none of that drift reaches this particular garden. Whoever was playing the flute has finished. The wine cup, if this was a night for one, has long since finished its circuit of the pond. The scent worked into tomorrow's robes is settling into the silk exactly as it was meant to. And behind the folding screens and the lowered blinds, in a house built to be rearranged a dozen times between dusk and dawn and never once resembling, room to room, the sealed and permanent house a much later century will build in its place. A woman who will not be remembered by name finishes the last lines of whatever she was writing tonight, sets it aside, and lets the household's long quiet close back in around her. 1,000 years on, almost none of what protected this one particular night survives in the way anyone here would recognize. The divinations, the directional taboos, the temple still quietly guarding its one unlucky corner of the compass, all of it has faded into history rather than daily practice. What hasn't faded is the feeling underneath all of it. The sense, at the end of a long day, that the world outside the walls is a little uncertain, and that drawing the screens a little closer, checking the details one more time, and trusting the morning to sort out whatever the night couldn't, is simply what a person does before finally, carefully, allowing themselves to sleep.